So it looks like the Guard are getting a new Supreme Commander. Let's talk about the upcoming Lord Solar model reveal, which Games Workshop have hinted that they're going to be showing us next week. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're going to be talking about one of the last and more exciting Guard model reveals. We've seen the Rogue Dawn and a bunch of other stuff for the Guard, but now apparently it's time for a Guard Supreme Commander to lead some mortal forces of humanity in a great crusade against the horrors of 40k. So far, the haul for the Imperial Guard out of this release really hasn't been too bad. We've got new Kazakin, new Cadians heavy weapon teams and a new command squad, an updated Sentinel kit and those new field ordnance batteries, the big heavy weapon teams, the Rogue Dawn tank, Attilan Rough Riders, and some characters including Acadian Castellan, the Commissar, and the new Creed. That's 11 kits so far, and apparently there's still one to come. On the preview article for the Rogue Dawn tank, Games Workshop said that one last model reveal will be coming next week, making it seem very likely indeed that the next model reveal is going to be the new Lord Solar model, who's been heavily rumoured in a bunch of different leak sources for really quite a long time now. If they're saying that this is one last model reveal, it implies that we're not getting any more after this. The Guard have had a very decent release out of this. 12 new kits in total is no bad thing whatsoever, though perhaps one of the kits that most needed an update seems like they're not going to be getting it. I feel like at the very least they could have come out with a Kathchan Regiment box, a set of models that could have kind of done with an update over a decade ago, but it still looks like the burly Rambo Guardsmen are still going to be waiting for an update. They've pretty much got to be high on Games Workshop's priority list at some stage. I wouldn't be too surprised if they got something like a Kill Team style release similar to Death Corps at some point, but it looks like it's not happening imminently. I'm sure they'll eventually get around to releasing the various different regiments in plastic, but they do seem to be taking their time about it. In any case though, the prospect of a new Lord Solar miniature is pretty interesting. A few factions have got some faction leaders in not too recent history. Perhaps the release of a Supreme Commander of the Guard does kind of mirror what we got for the Sisters of Battle with Morven Val, a nominal faction head to bring multiple strings of the force together. I guess we already had Creed as the most renowned general out of them, though I guess he only really commanded the Cadians of the Cadian Gate and was more of a sub-faction head than an overall leader that could bring multiple regiments of Guard together. The title Lord Solar really is an interesting one though. It basically means the commander of the Astra Militarum in the Segmentum Solar, the one with Terror in it at the centre of the galaxy from the Imperium's point of view. It's perhaps one of the most esteemed positions within the Imperial Guard, and in particular it's quite well known in the lore of 40k due to the actions of one Lord Solar Macarius, who both had the previous miniature that you can see here, and also had some rather awesome backstory about his conquests and the ensuing events. Lord Solar Macarius was a Guard commander from towards the end of the 41st millennium and was basically appointed at the rank of War Master by the High Lords of Terror, something that isn't given out very often. He led an enormous crusade of Astra Militarum forces in a crusade to the Galactic West, conquering thousands of worlds in the Emperor's name, in a grueling campaign of attrition and logistics for which he was renowned as a famous tactician. The only thing that eventually stopped his conquests was that his forces began to reach the edge of navigable space, where the light of the Emperor's Astronomicon meant that you could barely navigate in between stars, and eventually, much to his frustration, he was forced to turn things around and head back to navigable Imperial space. He's reported to have died very shortly after the conquest, a broken man as he was unable to continue his glorious conquests. He was made an Imperial Saint, and the Macarius heavy tank was named after him, one of the Forge World's big heavy tanks. Unfortunately, following his death and his unifying presence, much of the conquest worlds fell into anarchy or infighting, and such was the extent of the post-Macarian heresy that the Imperium was forced to muster a great crusade of many chapters of the Astartes to put order to the rebellious worlds. Perhaps a bit of a tainted legacy and one that cost the Imperium dear, but it did ultimately lead to a whole load of worlds joining the Imperial fold, and multiple victories against the Chaos and Xenos. As mentioned, he did previously have this miniature from Games Workshop, a gold armoured chap with a cane laurel wreath and a sword on his back. This one of course is now long out of production. My guess is that the new Lord Solar miniature won't be Macarius himself, he is dead in the lore after all, and they'd have to do an above average size of retcon to bring him back for some reason, so I'm guessing that it'll be a new character taking up his mantle as opposed to him himself. Still though, seems kind of appropriate as a faction leader. Presumably the new one will be unifying the Guard together in some great crusades, maybe to fight back against the forces of chaos from the Great Rift. As for the new model, it does sound like Games Workshop are going to be revealing it next week. It was already heavily rumoured by a bunch of different sources to be a cavalry model, very likely to be clad in golden armour, and indeed to have some heavy featuring of bionics that would feel very appropriate for the Imperial Guard. We also know that the model will be featuring on the limited edition Codex cover, the one that's going to be in that Cadia Stands box set. There's clearly a reason that it wasn't shown off, otherwise they definitely would have when they actually talked through the contents of the box. Though during the reveal video they did decide to tease us with this tiny little picture of the Codex cover that featured on the back of the box. Really hard to make out any proper details from that, but it does feature a cavalry model rearing up on its back legs. I'd guess that that's probably going to be the pose that we're going to get the new miniature in, and otherwise looks like it might have some red robes going on and some sort of helmet crest. I can't really make out any obvious weapons or anything on the model, though please let me know if you think your eyes can interpret the blurry picture better than I can. As I said, I would have guessed that the model will probably be a whole new character, not one that we've come across before and just kind of thrust onto the scene like Morven Val was. From Morty and Glory's Codex leaks, he had the name as Lord Solar Leonidas, or something really quite similar to that. That one's not a name that I've heard before unless it's cropped up in any fluff. Please let me know down in the comments if that's the case. I have noticed a bunch of people having at least some suspicion that the new model could be a promoted Yarrick who's reportedly gone from the Codex. I personally say that seems really quite unlikely to promote a Commissar, even a very storied one, into a Lord Commander, and I can't help but think that it might step on his lore a bit and replace his iconic silhouette with something completely different. So at the moment I'll put that in the very unlikely pile, but if it does turn out to be the case, I won't deny that it would be pretty awesome. I think perhaps the main thing that have people suggesting that that could be the case is that one of his weapons on the leak's profile was a gaze of the Lord Solar. And one thing that Yarrick is very famous for is having his Bale Eye that can unleash some major damage. If Yarrick were to be reimagined as a Lord Solar, I'm sure I'd keep that eye and some sort of beam attack from the eye shooting. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts as to how likely you think that is though. Finally, we do already have a leaked profile for him, this one of course courtesy of Morty and Glory's leaked playtest rules that he published before. I'll leave a link to those down in the video description. Definitely recommend checking out the channel if you're a guard player. According to the leaked rules, he's an 180 points HQ choice with the Supreme Commander tag. That would mean that he'd be really quite easy to field in most guard lists, as it means that he wouldn't be competing for an HQ slot, and you could just slot him in addition to whatever army that you're fielding. It's also quite likely that he wouldn't have any given regiment tag either, so likely wouldn't have any issues leading any given regiment along. It seems that the regimental tag still might have a bit of effect if you're trying to field any of their unique datasheets, say for example if you're trying to field Cadian shock troops or Kasachan jungle fighters, which are apparently getting their own datasheets. His stat line sounds like one of a fairly beefy character model, a 12-inch move and hitting on 2s, strength 6, toughness 4, 8 wounds, 6 attacks, leadership 10, a 3+ save and a 4+ invul. Fairly beefy all around, maybe not the hardest Supreme Commander to take out if you're comparing him to things like Morven Val for example. I'd guess that for the guard the emphasis is still slightly going to be on the leadership abilities as opposed to the combat prowess. Kind of makes more sense for unaugmented mortal humans, but it still looks like he'll pack a decent punch in a fight. From these leaks it does sound like his buffing abilities will be really quite good. He's going to get an aura of reroll 1s to hit and wound for nearby core units and for infantry characters. I guess that means that he wouldn't be affected by his own rerolls, as it sounds like he's going to be a cavalry character. On top of that, he also has a command phase buff where he gets to select one unit in the command phase. That unit gets rerolls to hit, and if it happens to be a core unit as well, then it means that you'd get rerolls to hit and to wound. To be honest, it's pretty big that you can get 4 rerolls on literally anything. That means that unless there's any restriction that we don't know about, you could get 4 rerolls to hit on something like a Baneblade for example. That's pretty massive with the amount of guns that you could be affecting there. Otherwise, for core units, it kind of depends on just how big and threatening a core unit that you can get with guard. I feel like most infantry units just aren't going to be quite exciting enough to use that on. Perhaps in theory, something like a big 10-man squad of those Attilan Rough Riders look like they could be quite interesting though. You could get a 200-point unit of them, and by all accounts they do look like they're kind of threatening in melee. As a fast-moving cavalry leader, he looks like he'd also have some pretty decent synergy with them. Otherwise, he also knows 3 orders and knows all types of order, so you could be issuing tank orders at the same time as you issue infantry ones. And then once the game begins, you've either got the option to swap out a secondary objective for another or gain a command point. Gaining the command point is really quite nice, particularly in Nephilim. I see it more of an option to swap out a secondary objective if it makes sense. Obviously I think that the main thing would be to try and pick the secondaries that you want to start with, but sometimes I suppose if you've seen what your opponent has, you could theoretically have a way to try and counter them. It might mean that they just reveal their game plan just a little bit, and it might mean that there's a way to counter them a bit better. I feel like picking the right secondaries just to start with though is likely going to be the best choice. Otherwise, in terms of weapons, he does have that Gaze of the Lord Solar attack, 12 inches and 2 shots as a pistol, strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3, so a pretty powerful shooting shot there. It does sound like it's an attack that's going to be coming from a bionic eye of some sort, so I can see why people are at least somewhat suspicious that it might be a new Yarick. As well as that, he's also equipped with a weapon called Conquest, Strength User, AP 3 and Damage 2. It does sound like that could absolutely be the Blade of Conquest, the relic that's been present in the last couple of Imperial Guard codexes, usually as a generic weapon pick that was a blade of the previous Solar Macarius. So I guess it makes sense, if you're billing someone else as a new Lord Solar, they might well pick up that weapon and take up the legacy. With 6 attacks at Strength 6, AP 3 and Damage 2, it's really not too bad, but it's not going to be a standout melee weapon if that's all he gets. I think he's more a character that's going to be there for the buffs and he'll lend a hand in close combat, but it doesn't look like he's going to be cutting down tanks or units of Terminators all by himself or anything. Overall though, looks like some pretty interesting rules for Mr. Lord Solar, and I'll certainly be interested to have a further talk about him once we get the model reveal, which hopefully should come out next Monday. Let me know your predictions for what we're going to see. I feel like this one's pretty interesting, and we've got plenty of stuff that isn't 100% confirmed yet. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see that. And also, if you have been enjoying these update videos quite a bit, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description. The channel's Patreon is what allows me to keep on making videos quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying a lot, then any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.